Welcome to Making Your Miles Count Production, an educational program to all Canadian lease owner-operators with your host, Robert Scheper.
All right, Make Your Miles Count, Taxes, Chapter 2, Job-Related Costs. When it comes to meals on the road, is probably one of the most, it is one of the most expensive things when you are on the road traveling, because eating at home costs $1, but when you're out on the road, it'll cost probably $1.50, maybe $2, depending on what you eat. I remember we were talking about this before, 30 years ago when we were driving. A lot of people purchased meals on the road at restaurants.
Oh, yes.
Truck stops had, Denny's and all the other ones out there, and everybody ate through meals. But that was back in the 1980s.
Yep.
80s and 90s. Actually, more 90s. Did you drive in the 80s?
I didn't. 85.
Yeah? 85. Oh, my goodness.
Yep.
1980 or 1990s, we were all still eating in restaurants. Then it became expensive. A combination, I guess, of expensive and restaurants closed.
Yeah, a lot of restaurants. But that did more, I think, in after 2000. The big truck stops now in the latter years, maybe 7 years ago, 5 years ago, were the big truck stops like Petro, TA. TA still has the restaurants, but the Petros, they went to fast food. Yeah. Everything went to fast food. But it was already 15 years ago where guys started eating out of their trucks.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I would agree with you. There was a humongous shift in the independent operator industry in the year 2000, 2001. That was, I called that the trucking tsunami recession, because it wiped out so many people. It was ridiculous. And that primarily had to do with the entire industry not having a fuel surcharge. But meals on the road, I mean, it wasn't all that bad a number of years ago, but now it's like... It's a major. You certainly can't afford 3 meals in a day, but it's a part of driving. You obviously have to eat out there.
Back in 2005, when my wife started driving full time with me, it was just then that they really started closing down. Mm-hmm. Denny's, a lot of the truck stops got the Denny's restaurant in them. It was very, very expensive. Yeah. So the guys didn't stop at Denny's. They started eating more and more out of the trucks. And it was only about maybe 3 years later, then Denny started to close because the drivers weren't coming in.
Yeah. Moving it from sit-down meal to fast food, the margins at the only food outlets, I guess, that could afford to stay operating in a truck stop.
Yeah, and they had Subways in there together with Dairy Queen, or they had Tim Hortons in some of them. Yeah. So they had like 3 or 4, like Pizza Hut, 3 or 4 small things, so you could had a variety to pick from.
Sure. But we're talking about job-related costs. In the Canadian tax, code, our Income Tax Act does allow for job-related costs. Let's talk specifically, for instance, like meals. Using a different industry, like there's many different ways in which CRA allows job-related costs to be utilized. In the construction industry, for instance, if you have a small crew of guys and you go out, the owner of the construction company can pay for the meals, for instance, when they're in, a remote area in there. There's another factor, too, and let's say there's a large construction site that is remote from a food restaurant or whatever. Yeah. A large construction company, how they relate with job-related costs or the meals, they can set up a big tent or a facility or something like that, and they can feed everybody on the construction site. That's another way that's allowed for that our income tax allows for job-related costs. The difficulty with trucking is that you're not stationary like in a construction site. You're moving all over the place, and there is a phrase. Both in the Income Tax Act as well as the GST Act, ability for a domestic home establishment. Do you have access to a domestic home establishment? I think that's the phrase that it uses, which means, can you go home, or can you have something like a hotel room or something like that? Do you have access to a home establishment? And A truck has a roof over the head with a bunk if they're doing long distance, but they don't have access to actually, making food or anything like that. Not in a typical sense.
Right.
We do in microwave and coolers and stuff like this, but that it's not considered domestic food establishment if you open a can of beans and in it. That's not
Right.
what it's referring to. So it says that you don't have access to a restaurant, or you don't have access to a home. Even in city, when you're doing city deliveries, you can't just take a highway tractor and go to a restaurant.
No,
Or
no.
park and go home for lunch or something like that. And CRA does, like the Income Tax Act, does acknowledge that you can't take this huge unit and be able to somehow or other have access to the same food resources that everybody else does. So that's how CRA allows it. Is number one is if you keep a meal receipt, if you actually purchase something at a restaurant, you can get reimbursed for it. But there is also another feature or factor, and that is instead of keeping all of the receipts, you actually get in an employer-employee relationship, you can get paid a flat rate fee. And they do call that a per diem, but per diem is just Latin for per day.
Okay.
Same as the TL2 uses per diem for per day for their forms, but it's very, very different in terms of application. So an employer can pay a flat rate fee per day, and that's what auditors get when they're sent out on the road. Actually, they're not sent out on the road very much anymore after COVID. Everything is all done by distance. Not everything, but most everything is done there. When it comes to CRA auditing independent operators, they do almost everything by distance. They would still go out to say larger companies with big inventory or something like
Right.
that, where they need to be on site more. But independent operators get treated very much. They can do everything by distance, which is good. It's very, very acceptable. But when it comes to meals on the road, it is very costly for a truck driver to accommodate meals while they're in charge of this extremely large vehicle. And the best available method of dealing with it is a flat rate per day cost. When it comes to very important dates in the Canadian trucking industry, August 24th, 2000 was probably one very significant date in the trucking industry when a man by the name of Don Wilkinson filled out his TL2 using $40 a day rather than $33 a day. He wanted to use $40 per day. I got the transcript of the actual court case, and in my second book I actually quote on it specifically what the judge said, what the prosecutor said, and it's extremely interesting because what actually occurred is the judge was arguing with the prosecutor or the CRA, the guy who's representing Canada Revenue Agency, and saying the argument Don Wilkinson said was that auditors were getting $48 per day, whereas he could only use $33. And he says, I go into the States and I want to use 40. And the judge, see if I can use this nicely, really lambasted CRA and says, how can you logically say, and he has to go into the States, that with exchange rate, that $33 is okay when your own guys get $48 per day. And the prosecutor representing CRA, he was dumbfounded. He said, "I don't know. I can't answer that question."
Yeah.
It was a very good day for Canadian trucking. From that perspective, it was very cool. But then it actually twisted a little bit further because the judge says, "Didn't you at one time argue this exact same situation with regards to automobile expenses?" I don't remember the exact dollar figures or the cents, but he says if somebody used their personal vehicle, the auditors got X amount of cents, but they wouldn't allow the general public to use above a certain dollar figure. And the prosecutor says, yes, you're right. I argued that case before you too. To be honest, I guess the prosecutor did humble himself, and he said, you're right. I lost that case then, and I'm arguing the same argument now,
Right.
whereas there's this huge difference between what we allow the public and what we do even ourselves.
Right.
And so it's a fabulous case. And then the conclusion, what the judge stated was, I can't understand why you keep bringing these aberrations. He used the word aberrations to me, where there's one standard for one and the other standard for a complete. I can't believe you keep bringing the up. I don't want to see this again. Basically, the auditor was sheepish and he took his humble pie, I guess. The point that the judge was making, he does not want to see this huge difference between what the public is allowed and what the private individual is doing. That was a great day for Canadian truckers. Now, the question then comes, how come there is this huge difference between what the Canadian truck driver through the TL2 is allowed? Back then they used $33 a day, and the employers or the government was using $48 a day. Two very, very different systems. Based on that court case, that's what spawned this class action lawsuit against Canada Revenue Agency back then. The firm in British Columbia got pretty much 1,000 truck drivers across Canada, I think more than that, to sign a petition and go through the courts for this. When they were bringing it through the court system, the judge was, and I quote the judge in my book as well, he said, you're not comparing apples to apples, you're comparing apples to monkeys, which were very, very, what he's saying is completely different. I actually agreed with the judge in the ruling, and that's why he said, no, it fails. You can't bring up the TL2 up to the what they're giving the auditors, because they're completely different systems. That's sort of like saying like a gasoline engine has to have spark plug, a diesel engine has to have spark plugs. You can't have one system overlapping into the other. That was the point of the judge, and going up all the way to the Supreme Court. Just on the logic itself, the Supreme Court did the right thing in shutting it down. But it doesn't solve the real problem. The real problem is not that the public are allowed this amount and the government is allowed this amount. The problem is that everybody should be allowed to use whatever system they want.
Correct.
So instead of just don't use the TL2, the really bad system, just go up to use the exact same system that the auditors use. And that's really the point of my book. That's where the huge difference in tax savings comes from the just using a different system. It's not different numbers. That's quite important to understand as we go through the book even further. Anyway, I wanted the judge in the case, number 1999-4687, the quote was, "It just boggles the mind that these kinds of aberrations can occur." That was the greatest line probably in the entire, book or case or whatever. These job-related costs is a conflict in any job. If you're in construction, you have to deal with meals when you're gone as well. Yeah. But truck driving is very specific. And the point that I was making in the book is, you know what? Let's no longer use what Canada Revenue Agency and the majority of accountants recommend. Let's just use the one that works the best. Correct. And that's really amazing. I think that's pretty much it for the major point on job-related costs. Now I want to go. We'll go into the next section.
Thanks for stopping by Making Your Miles Count. For further Making Your Miles Count productions, call us at 877-987-9787 or download us at makingyourmilescount.com.